Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. And thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how information is controlled and tyrannical governments, or governments that wish to impose micro controls on the population, which by definition has to be a tyranny, how they control the information and believe that controlling what we see and what we hear and what we're allowed to see and hear is how they can impose their controls, their micro controls on the population. Now, it's very ideological for obvious reasons, and we can see that any government that wants to, any form of government that wants to establish this level of control, whether it's for ideology or anything else, but they have to control the information and they have to control what you see and what you hear. So they put great store on exercising these controls and having quite severe penalties for not following on, and not just for printing pamphlets they don't like or making YouTube channels that displease the globalists or that sort of thing, but the mere fact that you're thinking it or might think it, or someone else may hear what you're saying and they may change their views away from the views that the tyrants want you to hold. Even anything and everything is seen as a threat. So for the tyrannical government, if even one person isn't going along with the fantasy and the illusion of the truth that they want to impose, if even one person's not going along, then that could be the beginning, the thin end of the wedge and the beginning of the end. So the idea of thinking freely and thinking, acting in the best interests of you as an individual or as for your family or those that are dependent on you, that's not the issue. They want to create the very understanding and definition of truth and fact. And we see this today in the mainstream media, the pro-globalist mainstream media across the Western world. They come out with the most outrageous and absurd propaganda, but because they can plaster it wall to wall, 95% of what we see is controlled by the globalists, then they can get away with it and are getting away with it to a large extent. Now, there are a few pockets of say cable news that don't go along with the globalist message, Tucker Carlson as an example. There's also quite a substantial anti-globalization, questioning globalization, pointing out the folly of globalization going on social media. But we notice that when any YouTube channel, for example, if any social media channel gets a good following and it's anti-globalist, we notice that it gets shut down. So only small channels that have a much lesser following are allowed to continue operating, and even ones that are there are ones I'm noticing now where they've come quite a long way in the last 6 to 8 months, and they've gone from quite small viewerships and subscriber bases into something much more substantial. And as soon as they reach a certain threshold, suddenly the attacks begin, and they're being taken offline, and they're receiving all sorts of penalties and controls. And this is obviously because they've now got a following. They were saying exactly the same things, months before, but they were considered too small to be of consequence. But as soon as they do get a following, then that's it. They're now a threat to the narrative, and they have to be shut down or hampered in some way. So this information control is something that and if we look at the Soviet Union as a case in point, now they wanted to impose on an unwilling populace a socialist, communist, top-down, very brutal revolution, and not everybody wanted to go along with it. There was many people that it meant they were much worse off than before, and not just the aristocrats. Some of the more successful farm owners and that sort of thing, they weren't going to do very good out of it. And so the Soviets were prepared to accept any collateral damage in pursuit of their objectives, and which meant millions of people had to die in pursuit of an objective which was allegedly going to be a workers' paradise. How you can achieve a paradise through tens of millions of people being mass murdered and so on is quite beyond my comprehension. But anyway, that was the course of the very brutal course of action they took, which, by the way, is the same course of action that communist China took, Mao Zedong, same course of action that Pol Pot in Cambodia took, and numerous other revolutions around the world. The Marxist dictatorships, tin pot dictatorships in Africa, for example, were very big on attempted genocide, and so it's something that goes on. But the definition of fact and truth is a big issue here, and the Soviets attempted to completely control all information that people saw, and through that, the very definition of what was truth. In fact, the Soviet official newspaper, Pravda, that's Russian for truth or fact, which is absurd given the bullshit that was in there. But once once there's nobody there saying, well, no, that's not true, or that's not accurate, or that's not factual, or that's nonsense. Once there's no one around to question it, or to shine a light on the lies, once that's there, then fantasy. The fantasy narrative takes over, which is where we are now in the West. We look at just pure fantasy narratives. For example, people go to school board meetings to complain about propaganda that requires that the kids hate white people, for example. If they go to a school board meeting to complain about that, they're now terrorists. They are domestic terrorists, and the full force of the law needs to be brought down upon them, and they need to be intimidated and harassed and so on. So this is part of where, once you shut down accuracy and fact in the information flow, you then go to fantasy, because there's no one to call it out. There's no one to say, well, that's crap. So they can then go to fantasy, but no one's going to call that out either. So the fantasy narrative takes on. If we look at America, is now beset, allegedly, white supremacists are everywhere, Nazis, fascists, domestic terrorists. And so anyone that opposes, disagrees with the globalist narrative will now be given a label that's just drawn out of pure absurd ideological fantasy, and then the politicized organs of the state, instead of worrying about murders and so on, then no, they're going to come after wrongthink. So you can have a shootout in a Chicago street, and where people get murdered and seriously injured in gunfire in a gun battle. That's no big deal. Hey, who cares? A mean tweet is the real issue here, or a parent complaining about pornography being pushed on their 10-year-old child at school. They're the terrorists. They're the ones we have to go after. And again, this is, once the fantasy narrative takes hold, as soon as you start moving away from reality and fact and so on, then you go into this fantasy narrative. And so that's what the tyrants and the tyrannical governments are attempting to protect. They want the fantasy narrative, and the fantasy narrative is how, as they see it, they can control the population. And it's an act in it's a sort of perverse form of humiliation. You know it's a lie, you know it's untrue, you know it's fantasy, you know it's complete and utter bullshit, but you also know that if you say so, or if they even think that you think it's bullshit, they'll come after you and make your life as miserable as they possibly can, using the apparatus of the state to threaten and intimidate you. Now, one of the interesting things about the end of the Soviet era, when the Soviet empire disintegrated, was, I assumed that given that 96% of the population had known nothing but communism, they'd known nothing else. They'd lived under communism all their lives. I assumed that they would be that they would have at least accepted communism as the way things were done, and been quite sort of surprised, if not like a fish out of water in capitalism, because they were so controlled and so bombarded with propaganda and nonsense and fantasy and ideology and so on, that they wouldn't know what to do if they got out of that situation, or if those props were taken away. And I was rather surprised at how many people came up and from Russia, and they knew it was all crap. In fact, the entire Eastern Bloc, everybody knew it was all lies, and they went along with it because there's no option. If they didn't, then they were going to get arrested, and often they would do things like they would go to someone and say, look, if you hold these views, we're going to make sure that your sick grandmother in the nursing home, we're going to make sure that she's put out on the street. Who we're going to find an irregularity in her paperwork, and she's going to be out on the street. She's going to die of starvation, and what are you going to do about that? But if you want to doubt the official line, then we'll attack your relatives, and you've got that handicapped kid that's being looked after. We're going to make sure they don't get that, and so on. So there's lots of ways they can come at you to attack you, and there's always in a very bureaucratic state, there's always some paperwork irregularity somewhere they can find to use against you, and to say, well, we have to. It's another month until the committee meets, so your ration card is invalid for that time. So they can get at you. There's 100 ways they can get at you if they want to, and of course they do. So you have to go along with it, but we need to understand something called sullen resentment. This is where you don't agree, it's crap, it's bullshit, you're being fed ideological nonsense, that, but you pretend to go along with it. You pretend that yes, I believe that up is down and black is white, and I believe all that. Yes, that's right. And we can look at the novel, George Orwell's 1984, to look at some of the mind fuck tricks that the party in that novel played, which are very similar to how they did in the Soviet Union, or any tyrannical regime for that matter. But this idea of sullen resentment that stays with the populace. And I saw this in the Soviet Union when it collapsed, and people who came to, for example, Australia, or even elsewhere. I was meeting people in the United States and all over the place that had got out Britain and that had got out of the Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union after everything disintegrated and the communist bloc fell apart. And according to them, they never believed the propaganda, or they realised that it was an essential part of the apparatus that was used to control them. And so they had this sullen resentment of having to spend hours upon hours queuing up for something, or to have a very ordinary diet, to not have access to consumer goods, to be under constant threat of someone accusing you of something, because there were snitches everywhere. That was how it worked. The threat of you couldn't. I mean, if you commented about something very simple, the train was late, or you had to queue for too long to get bread at the bread shop, or things like that. That wasn't viewed as by the authorities. That wasn't viewed as a complaint about things could be made better, which they, of course, could if you're queuing for hours for a loaf of bread. But that was viewed as an attack on the state, and because you were undermining the confidence people had, as the state viewed it, undermining the confidence people had in the fact that communism was the best system ever, and nothing was better than that. So therefore, if you're attacking the state, then you're an enemy of the people, and you're a counter-revolutionary, and you can go to prison for that. And there's a very low bar of evidence required to throw you in the slammer for that sort of stuff. And almost every second person was an informant, or believed that if they had a conversation with you and you said something about the bread, and they would then say, well, gee, that means that person could then accuse me of not reporting that incident, so I better report it just in case I get reported on. So you had this situation where people were clamoring, and we see it now in Western social media, where everyone wants to join the outrage mob, with a more shrill voice than the previous person had, because then it shows just how virtuous they are in this crazy world. But this thing of sullen resentment, it's something that I see this, and I'm sure many people do see it in the West at the moment, that people don't believe the narrative that the government is carrying on. They don't believe that there's white supremacists or that there was an insurrection in January. They don't believe any of that. They don't believe that Joe Biden got 12 million more votes than any other presidential candidate ever in the history of presidential elections. They don't believe that. But that the narrative is still pushed. And the way to get people to accept the narrative is to say, well, if you don't believe what we tell you, no matter how crazy it is, if you don't believe it, we will hurt you. We will get at you somehow. And so this people can, well, gee, I'll go along with it, or I'll pretend to go along with it. So there's this massive section of the population that is just filled with sullen resentment about what's going on, but they have no means to express it. They have no political candidate they can vote for that is going to change anything. There's no government department they can go to say, hey, this is a bit much. Really, you've got to stop doing this, because that means they will then be targeted. And the Soviets did this, or the East, the whole communist bloc did this. They would leave books in the library, Charles Dickens or Shakespeare or something like that. They would leave those books in the library. But if you and they were there as bait. If you hired took those books out of the library, borrowed those books, then the secret police would come around to your door and say, well, why are you looking at Western bourgeois literature? It must mean that you harbour bourgeois thoughts. And if you harbour bourgeois thoughts, it must mean that you're a counter-revolutionary. And if you're a counter-revolutionary, you're an enemy of the people. Now, that automatic escalation thing is also happening in the West now. So if you believe that your children should not be taught pornography or to hate white people, that means you're a racist. If you're a racist, it means you're a bigot. If you're a bigot, it means you're a fascist. If you're a fascist, it means you're a Nazi. If you're a Nazi, it means you're a white supremacist. And if you're a white supremacist, it means you are a terrorist and should go to prison. So that's how they play this ideological game. There's no proof or evidence. There's just these ideological assertions as they move up the totem pole. But we need to understand how control of information is tyranny. So when they try to throttle off all other sources of information, all other viewpoints, all other beliefs and attitudes, then it shows just how weak their position is. They can only impose their lies, as they would see it, successfully if there's no other information coming out that shines a light on that. And it also again illustrates how we need a free and independent media. No business should be allowed to own the media and have 95% of the media has exactly the same talking points, exactly the same, that they spread all across the Western world at the same time. I mean, that's how much tyranny we're facing through the control of information and the invention of fantasy reality, which is where we are now. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.